It's 1191 AD. The siege of Acre has seen the Christian army on its last leg, surrounded by the Ayyubid armies of Saladin as they're trying to siege Acre. It also was the arrival of King Richard I of England, a Plantagenet king, a famed warrior known for leading his men in the fierce battles leading from the front. He was known as the Lionheart, King Richard the Lionheart. It's the Third Crusade in the Holy Land, and upon arrival, Richard had become the crusade overall commander, much to the chagrin of King Philip II of France, who had also arrived with a large retinue of soldiers and knights. Right out the gate, Richard started bombarding what was called the Cursed Tower at the corner of the Acre Citadel in an effort to weaken it. He did this with a trebuchet named Bad Neighbor and other catapults, along with the relentless attacks of the ground troops. Seeing the end of Acre's siege, this left King Richard to deal with the Ayyubid army led by his new nemesis, Saladin, a brilliant military commander who had an aura of invincibility due to his success in the Second Crusade. Now, Acre was one of the longest sieges of the Middle Ages. It lasted from 1189 to 1191. King Philip of France and Leopold of Austria soon decided they were going to leave, and they did leave, heading Sicily and to home due to rifts in the Crusader leadership. This left Richard the Lionheart to have uncontested leadership of the Crusader army. King Richard assumed the Plantagenet crown and had taken up the cross at the death of his father, King Henry I of England. Even before the papal bull calling for a third crusade by the Pope, Richard had already taken this cross. His journey to the Holy Land saw intrigue and adventure, as well as his conquering of Cyrus along the way, an island that would become vital to the supplying of the Christians in the Holy Land and the Crusades. Now, the siege of Acre was but the first act of the Third Crusade, with King Richard setting his sights on retaking Jerusalem. But in his way was the Ayyubid commander Saladin and his massive Muslim army, a well-trained, disciplined, and veteran army, the same army that had taken Jerusalem from the Christians during the Second Crusade. This was two of the greatest commanders of medieval times, locking horns in a holy war, jihad, for the Holy Land. Now, King Richard made plans to march on Jerusalem by way of the coast, marching from Acre to Jaffa, having ships follow his ground troops in order to keep them supplied and have a mobile platform to transport troops quickly if needed. All the while, he would be shadowed by Saladin and his Ayyubid army, which stayed concealed in the woods around and the hills of the Levant. Richard the Lionheart's army consisted of 1,200 knights and 10,000 men-at-arms, consisting of Knights Templars, Knights Hospitaller, Knights Teutonic, as well as his own contingent of troops, along with some French and other mixed-in multinational people making a multinational army. King Richard meticulously planned his route to Jaffa along the coast. This route could protect his large baggage train, and it was a 130-kilometer trek in the blistering summer heat. This was going to be a tough march, and it always had the shadow of Saladin looming over it and his Ayyubid army, constantly harassing Richard's troops, costing the Christians 400 or so horses and quite a few men. The Crusader army slowed drastically as it rounded the spur of Mount Carmel near Haifa, and Richard's supply ships had to deal with the gusting, swirling, and sometimes just the wind dying, while his ground troops were being harassed by hit-and-run tactics from Saladin. Once past Mount Carmel, King Richard halted in an area known as the Castle of the Narrow Ways, before continuing through the marshland known as the Plain of Sharon, an area covered in thick vegetation. Meanwhile, Saladin encamped the bulk of his army, having his scouts watch King Richard's movement south towards Caesarea. Saladin, a master strategist, had plans to intercept and annihilate the smaller Christian army with his 25,000-man army near Asuf. Saladin was waiting for the right time to strike and head off this upstart Richard the Lionheart. The Lionheart led his army into the ghost town of Caesarea, encamping for 3 days south of Caesarea near the River of the Dead. Richard had been watching for a surprise attack for days from Saladin and his army. He just did not know when and where it would strike. Soon after leaving Caesarea, the skirmishes started to grow more intense, prompting Richard to stay center of his marching column to help coordinate counters to the Ayyubid strikes to his army. It was then that King Richard Lionheart, using tactical brilliance, organized his army columns into 5 divisions of marching columns. King Richard's vanguard was the Knights Templar, infused with lightly armed Torquipoles, and they were led by Grand Master Robert de Saval. Next were the Angevins and Bretons from Aquitaine. The 3rd Division were men-at-arms for Poitou. Both of those divisions were led by King Guy. English and Norman heavy cavalry troops made up the 4th Division, and the 5th Division, the rear guard, were the Knights Hospitallers mixed in with some French knights, led by Grand Master Garnier de Nablus. The Duke of Burgundy accompanied King Richard up and down the ranks of his army to bolster his troops' spirits and keep them in tight formation at the same time. The afternoon of September 5th, King Richard encamped his army at Wadi el Falik near the ruins of Asuf. It was then that Richard sent an envoy to meet with Saladin's brother, Al-Adil Saif ad-Din, aka Safadim to the Crusaders, in an effort to negotiate some type of peace terms. Now, Saladin had his brother stall the peace talks so he could gather as many reinforcements as he could from throughout the Sultanate. The next day, King Richard himself met Safadim, demanding the cessation of all conquered Holy Lands of Jerusalem back to King Guy. These demands angered Safadim, and he broke off peace talks against Saladin's wishes. And although Saladin had already moved his army out of the forest of Asuf onto the plains south of Asuf, King Richard the Lionheart's reassembled divisions started slowly moving south while Safadim waited. The Crusader scouts alerted King Richard to an imminent attack from Saladin, not sure of exactly when and where the attack was going to commence. It was mid-morning when, out of nowhere, the Nubian and Bedouin skirmishers attacked Richard's formations. These were followed by beating drums and blazing trumpets, signaling the Ayyubid army to attack. The Battle of Asuf had begun. The Crusader army braced for the attack and the impact, and suddenly Safadim and his cavalry hit the French and Hospitaller division in the rear, as well as Al-Abdal's Egyptian cavalry attacked from the east, hitting the Hospitallers and the French. The French Hospitallers were being hit from 2 sides, and the pressure was being poured on the Knights. Then all of a sudden, they were also hit by the Syrian cavalry, making the pressure that much worse, and wondering if they could even hold. A simultaneous attack of Muslim squadrons hit the middle divisions, keeping reinforcements from helping the 5th Rearguard Division. Saladin moved his elite shock cavalry, the Mamluk Household Guard, behind Al-Afdin's troops to exploit gaps in the Crusader lines. Under immense pressure, with his men fighting for every inch, trying not to break, a frustrated Master Garnier de Nablus sent word to Lionheart that his men could not hold much longer, asking for a charge to break the lines. But King Richard said, "No, wait for my signal." Richard the Lionheart had seen the Muslims starting to get frustrated and not being able to break the lines of his smaller Crusader army. How they were attacking and they were just washing off the lines, his men holding. He was waiting for that precise time to counterattack. The rear guard was put under even more pressure despite Garnier's frustration, and Richard's repeated demand of a charge against the Muslims was having to wait. Saladin, meanwhile, was making his pressure known all day. Saladin was all around the battlefield encouraging his troops, keeping the pressure poured on the Christian army. Grandmaster Garnier had asked several times for an please have the permission to charge, that they could not hold the line no longer back there, but King Richard kept telling them to wait. Then all of a sudden, two knights had had enough. The Hospitaller Marshal and Baldwin Le Caron, one of Richard's retinue, both rode out towards the Muslims in a gallop on their steeds. Now, Grandmaster Garnier, upon seeing this, gave the word for the Hospitallers and French to charge. Richard, seeing that his 5th Division was already charging, knew the time was now, and he started giving the signal to initiate a full-scale attack, except for those that were guarding the household standard. Richard and his retinue smashed into the Ayyubid lines, lances and swords drawn, with Richard in the center of the action. The lines still inching towards Arsuf. King Yi and the Vanguard Division had already reached the orchards outside of Arsuf. Now, disorganized, the Muslim army was all of a sudden about to break under the Crusader heavy cavalry charge. When Saladin released his Mamluk cavalry, the only cavalry that he had that could stand up to the Crusader heavy knights, but the move was too late, and the Ayyubid army, despite its numerical advantage, broke in retreat toward the forest of Arsuf. Richard then commanded his troops to push them, but to halt at the wood line. He did not want them pursuing the Muslims because he feared there may be a feigned retreat and a trap. The Crusader army fell back, regrouped, and formed another charge, getting rid of all the stragglers on the battlefield. The battle had broke the myth of Saladin's invincibility while proving the strategic prowess and leadership of Richard the Lionheart. The Crusaders lost only 700 men and a few cavalry participants that were lost, along with 400 horses, compared to the Muslim losses, which were over 7,000 men. The Crusader army continued its march to Jaffa, capturing the strategic port, and soon afterward, the beginning of the end of the Third Crusade had just arrived, and the march to Jerusalem met opposition, with the opportunity to strike at Saladin's heart by marching on Egypt was also lost. Despite Lionheart's wins, his army was deeply divided on attacking Egypt or Jerusalem. Saladin had lost face with his emirs due to this battle and saw his army weaken to the point that he couldn't provoke Richard into a decisive battle. So he did what he could to block the routes to Egypt and to Jerusalem to stall King Richard if he did advance. But King Richard had also gotten word that his brother John in England had taken over his Angevin holdings and was threatening Richard's crown. So Richard built up Jaffa's defenses before returning back to Acre. Almost a year after the Battle of Arsuf, it was summer 1192, it saw two separate advances on Jerusalem which stalled due to logistics and lack of manpower. Though Saladin's army was weakened due to the deserters and his emirs losing faith in their leader, furthermore, Saladin had fell seriously ill, which hurt since his charisma was not being used to keep his army intact. Now, Richard the Lionheart wasn't faring much better. He had been sick, But he also realized how divided his multinational Crusader army was, his council never agreeing on a course of action. And furthermore, word had gotten to Richard that his brother John and King Philip of France were plotting to take Richard's Angevin holdings, prompting Richard to prepare to return back home. He concentrated his focus at Acre, waiting on favorable winds to take him westward. He did not know how desperate Saladin was to reacquire his lost prestige by driving the Crusaders from the Levant forever. Saladin had gathered his emirs for a war council to do just that. The council lasted 3 days. On Richard's march back to Acre from Jaffa, he famously sent a message to Saladin: "Do not be deceived by my withdrawal. The ram backs away in order to headbutt." Reopening peace feelers was also something that was done with Saladin. These feelers were to help stall Saladin, and it worked. Saladin was trying to amass new troops from Egypt and elsewhere around his sultanate. Once in Acre, Richard the Lionheart amassed a fleet of 36 ships and had got the Grand Master's blessing for a future voyage. To Saladin, this looked as if Richard was leaving the Holy Land, and Saladin acted quickly, and by morning of July 27th, he was before Jaffa's walls, about to lay siege to the Christian garrison there. Though Saladin's army was not suited for a siege, so Saladin ordered an all-out attack on the town, along with siege towers. The Muslims pressed hard, but Richard's improvements proved their worth, beating back the Muslims. Luckily, the garrison was able to send word to Richard and Acre that they were in trouble. The next 3 days saw Saladin bringing up siege engines, 6 of them total, and by July 31st, they had penetrated Jaffa's eastern gate and walls. Suddenly, Saladin ordered forward, and the thundering hordes of his Muslim horsemen shook the ramparts of Jaffa. The Christians had to fall back to the citadel, praying someone will hopefully come to their aid. The Christian garrison was saved due to the actions of Ralph, the newly ordained Bishop of Bethlehem. He negotiated a brief truce with Saladin, which would expire the 9th hour of the next day. Meanwhile, Richard had also gathered up a force to save Jaffa. All but the French answered Richard's call. Negotiations were reopened, both sides trying to mask their shortcomings and their intentions. All signs told Saladin Richard was leaving for the Holy Land, and he decided to strike quickly, assaulting the city of Jaffa and the Christians inside. Luckily, Richard had worked on Jaffa's defenses. Richard and his retinue had boarded his royal ship, the Trenchmere, accompanied by 6 other galleons, heading south with all haste to reach Jaffa. Saladin had expected relief and blocked the roads, which slowed the effort slightly, but the real factor was the wind dying around Mount Carmel, leaving the galleys dead at sea. Finally, the breeze picked up, and 3 days of prayers saw that at daybreak on August 1st, the shining light on Muslim banners all around the walls of Jaffa. Now, Richard had thought he had arrived too late when he seen all the Muslim banners along the walls of Jaffa, until a priest who was able to escape the citadel jumped from the walls and swam to King Richard's boat, alerting him of the Christians in the citadel. So Richard acted quickly. Half dressed in his armor, he jumped into waist-deep water, a sword in one hand, a crossbow in the other, and shooting the crossbow repeatedly. Richard the Lionheart was showing his shock and awe, scaring the Muslims, and they rushed back into the city away from Richard and his troops, with Richard and his troops pushing hard on their heels. He threw the Muslims into disarray. The Christians in the citadel saw Richard the Lionheart's standard, and hope was renewed. Seeing themselves refugees to the citadel spilled on the streets, hoping to link up with the Lionheart. The Muslims everything they could. They fought bravely and ferociously. A renewed push was started, throwing the Muslims into further disarray. The battle that was happening moments ago became a rout. Saladin, and just rising in his tent, could do nothing to save his army that had been thrown into confusion, as well as his camp. Many troops retreated, fearing being trapped, and it took several hours to finally regain cohesion of his army. And this happened in Yazur, a few kilometers away. As darkness claimed the light, both armies prepared for the battle to come the next day. Richard's unexpected appearance stunned Saladin, and Saladin demanded a response from his emirs. He wanted a counterstrike, especially knowing his army was larger than the Crusader army. Saladin wanted to counterattack, but Richard expected this, and he rebuilt Jaffa's defenses and left reinforcements, and also welcomed reinforcements from the Templars, the Hospitallers, and the Knights with the Count Henry of Champagne. Richard even hosted a few of Saladin's emirs, bragging how he was going to stay in the Holy Land until next Easter. August 5th saw Saladin enacting a plan to kidnap Richard and destroy the Christian army, or so he thought. As the Muslims slipped towards the camp, they were spotted, and Richard was alerting, foiling the kidnapped attempt. Richard formed a mobile attack group made up of knights, medieval heavy cavalry, and addressed them as follows: adversities reveal virtues, just as prosperity hides them. Besides, there's nowhere to run, so you must stand firm. True men should either triumph courageously or die gloriously. Though the Muslim army was confident in its size, it was not attacking with any cohesion, and attack after attack just melted before the Christian lances, and the crossbowmen were giving the Muslims fits. The Lionheart rode up and down the line, bolstering his troops anywhere they needed it, and around 3 p.m. Richard called for a massive charge and for his crossbowmen to press forward. A chronicler wrote, "He was like a giant in battle. His body was like brass, unyielding to any sort of weapon. His right hand brandished his sword with quick, powerful strokes, slicing through the charging enemy, cutting them in two as he met them. Saladin helplessly watched his army melt away before Richard's might. The evening had both leaders counting their losses. The Ayyubid army had lost 700 men and 1,500 horses. The Crusaders had only lost 2 to death and had quite a few injured. On September 3rd, a truce was finally reached, a truce that would last 3 years. The Christians relinquished Ascalon and Durham, recognizing Acre as the new capital of the Holy Land. Jerusalem stayed in Muslim hands, but Saladin gave his word to protect all Christian pilgrims to and from Jerusalem. The Ayyubid army started to break up, and Richard had set sail October 9th for England. Thus ended the Third Crusade, a crusade that saw 2 of the greatest medieval leaders of all time, one Christian, one Muslim, locked in jihad, a holy war. Both men stood for what they believed in, and they both understood the complexities of holding the Holy Land and the Holy City. Both showed grim determination and a will to win. And I thank you for listening to this episode. This is Big Dude 6. Until next time.